Welcome to our presentation, How Did the Dam Meeting Go? A collaborative approach to evaluating dam decision-making processes. I am representing the team of researchers you see here and the work we conducted together in 2018 to 2020 as part of the multi-state, multidisciplinary Future of Dams project, as well as a separately funded U.S. Geological Survey Water Resources Research Institute grant. Nearly 300 hydropowered dams are coming up for relicensing across the country in the next decade, around 45% of which are in the Northeast. Relicensing is a key opportunity that only comes around every 30 to 50 years to reassess or reevaluate the dam infrastructure in the public waterway and think about the environmental, economic, and social impacts of the dam. Although FERC, the dam owner, and a collection of state and federal agencies are the official decision makers, other members of the public can plug into the process through public comments, public hearings, or as a legal intervener in the process. Through the National Science Foundation-funded Future of Dams grant, we led a project that involved other researchers and many stakeholders in an iterative design of a group participatory workshop process and model based on a decision support tool known as Multi-Criteria Decision Analysis, or MCDA. It involved 3 studies which generated research data in the form of researcher observations, participant results from the model, and a series of pre- and post surveys. It also led to a 2-dimensional analysis across the 3 case studies. I discussed this overall project more in depth in the presentation, Participatory Dam Decision Support, in the Fish Passage and Public Safety session of this conference on March 31st. In this presentation right now, I am going to discuss a USGS Water Resources Research Institute grant project that involved some additional stakeholder engaged discussions with some of the same stakeholders from the Future of Dams work that we hosted over the same time period that presented iterative learnings that fed into and were influenced by Study 3 and the 2-dimensional analysis we conducted on these studies in particular. Our iterative studies for the Future of Dams grant focused on a decision support tool called Multi-Criteria Decision Analysis, which is a unique framework that helps people balance competing objectives, making trade-offs explicit, and providing recommendations based on data and preferences. MCDA extends the idea of cost-benefit analysis to include qualitative data more easily, and does not require monetization, which can be a complicated and uncertain process for ecosystem services. MCDA is both a model and a process. The model is a quantitative representation of a complex decision that includes multiple decision criteria and alternatives, culminating in a transparent way to rank choices based on data and preferences without needing to apply monetary values to criteria that are difficult to monetize. There are many different computational methods that fall under the umbrella term MCDA and limited practical use in energy and watershed decision-making, or single versus multi-dam comparisons. If you want to learn more about the model, I recommend watching my presentation, Participatory Dam Decision Support, in the Fish Passage and Public Safety session of this conference from March 31st. The process speaks to the participatory side of MCDA, how people are engaged in it. MCDA can be used as a researcher-centered model, and the end result calculations can live in academic papers and presentations. Most MCDA models proceed this way, but participatory MCDA implies that people interact in some way with the model by doing some or all of identifying decision criteria and alternatives, identifying relative preferences for decision criteria, actually using the model individually and/or as a group, engaging in discussion that identifies shared or negotiated group preferences, comparing individual and group results, and participating in iterative design of the model and/or process, all of which can happen with a single and/or multiple dam focus. In the 3 studies we conducted as part of the Future of Dams grant, we used iterative versions that changed based on our learning, of a MCDA model and process. We knew that participatory workshops are a key component to planning for dams and other water resource and energy decisions. We wanted to develop a way to evaluate whether the participatory process and model we developed was effective or not, and we wanted to incorporate the vast experience of practitioners in this evaluation process. Therefore, we set out to ask, how do researchers and stakeholders evaluate success in group decision-making processes, and what tools can help both participants and researchers improve their understanding of what works for different groups? We conducted several activities to help answer this question. First, we conducted a literature review of academic studies to see how researchers had evaluated participatory processes they had led or been involved with, and what tools they had used. We reviewed 24 academic studies in this scoping activity. Then we facilitated 4 visioning meetings, where we invited different groups of people involved in dam decisions to identify characteristics of successful group participatory processes of which they had been a part in the past. Which ones were successful, and how did they know? What key aspects of those experiences could they point to in order to determine if it was successful? We used the results of the literature review and visioning meetings to develop a draft rubric, a table of characteristics of an effective group participatory process with descriptions of these characteristics and a rating system. We sent this draft rubric out to our collaborators and asked them to participate in a second rubric-building discussion to workshop the draft rubric into something that is more representative of and useful for their situations. In addition to this more formalized procedure, we also participated in regular discussions over the course of 2 years with an internal Future of Dams working group that spanned the 3 states involved in the grant and several disciplines, in which we workshopped different evaluation procedures for the different types of workshops different researchers were working on. Although these experiences weren't directly and systematically tied in with the main work presented here, there was an element of iterative influence between the 2 sets of activities. In our literature review of 24 studies, we only found 1 study, Martunen et al., that systematically evaluated participatory MCDA. And in particular, they look at the interactivity of MCDA, how much participants interact with the MCDA aspect, and integration of MCDA into the decision-making process. They were fortunate to have several studies in which MCDA was integrated into real dam decision-making about lake level regulation in Finland. Otherwise, we found a couple of studies that discussed evaluation before the workshop happened, and others that evaluated MCDA approaches, but without a focus on the participatory processes. Some examples are shown here. We have a journal article very close to submission about this literature review. It provides an overview of the variety of MCDA methods, both modeling and process, our review of 24 group participatory MCDA and some non-MCDA studies of water resource and energy applications, organized by MCDA type, and we present a 2-dimensional assessment or rating of each article's depth of stakeholder participation and model complexity to help inform which approaches may be better suited to which applications. In this 2-dimensional analysis, we focus on depth of engagement as 1 dimension, on a spectrum ranging from no engagement, for example, the researcher generates or simulates decision-maker preferences, to full group-based negotiation or discussion, iterative group engagement through preference elicitation and negotiation. The second dimension is model complexity, ranging from no model use at all in the participatory process to highly technical or complex, where the researcher is required to drive a model that has very advanced mathematical calculations. In our literature review, we plot the studies we reviewed along these 2 dimensions to show the variety of engagement, depth, and model complexity being used in different group participatory MCDA studies. We also evaluated our own 3 studies along these 2 dimensions. In a second expanded article, also based on those 24 studies, we go further to identify and define 7 evaluative criteria and 22 sub-criteria for selecting an MCDA approach for hydropower dam decision support. We create a Likert scale rating for each evaluative sub-criterion and apply the rating to the 24 application studies, calculating a weighted sum MCDA score for each model process approach identified in application studies, to further help inform which application to choose for which water resource or energy decision support application. Here is the evaluative rubric we came up with from the literature review. The 7 main criteria are listed in the first column. This screenshot only shows the first 4, along with whether the criterion is designed to evaluate the model, the process, or a combination of model and process, or the outcomes from the model or process. The second column identifies sub-criteria under these 7 main criteria. The next 2 columns describe what situation might receive a poor or 1-point rating and what might receive an excellent rating. The idea is the user would select a number between 1 and 5 to evaluate their model and process based on these descriptions and how close they view the model and process being to the ideal 5-point excellent rating versus the low 1-point poor rating. Here are the next 2 main criteria and their sub-criteria. And the final 2. In all, we have 22 sub-criteria in this version of the rubric. The rubric that evolved from the combination of literature review and the 4 visioning and 2 rubric building discussions with stakeholders is much more expanded, with the main portion still here in yellow. However, we made this version easier to sort, so you see the main evaluation criteria are listed in each row. So if you want to filter the rubric for just criteria that relate to accessibility, for example, you could. The focus topics are similarly broken out in the first column. So you can sort for only model criteria if you want, for example. On the right, we added suggested and tested methods for evaluating the criterion, ranging from a post-survey assessment to observation during the survey, and some other ideas. We include sample survey questions, an easy-to-reference column to know if something is potentially observable during the workshop, and if so, the types of things one might want to look for in the workshop to help them evaluate the criteria. During one version of the stakeholder rubric, we contracted the criteria down to 17 because there seemed to be interest in having a shorter document. But through further discussions, it became clear there was more benefit to separating everything out clearly and allowing the user to cut down themselves on what they may not want to include by deleting different rows. So the stakeholder rubric actually grew to have more sub-criteria than the academic rubric, with 30 sub-criteria in all. The last 4 address sustainability outcomes, divided into 4 categories of sustainability that are consistent with what I teach about in my energy classes at Maine and do research about related to renewable energy. And finally, we come to the end of the expanded stakeholder rubric. In order to actually use the rubric for our own workshop, we developed a set of tools to help us systematically record data or evidence to help decide if a criterion warranted a 5 or a 1 or somewhere in between. One such tool is a workshop observer worksheet. This worksheet, which was developed as an editable Word document, includes the focus, subcriterion name, and a description of what the observer should be looking for as they observe the participants in the workshop, what to take notes about. We had 3 observers at our workshop using this worksheet in our Study 3 workshop. We also developed a pre- and post survey, which we disseminated to workshop participants, in part to collect data for the evaluation. Here are some of the responses. We asked participants to rate on a 5-point Likert scale how much they liked or disliked different aspects of the workshop. You can see the workshop got high mean scores for most of the components, with some mixed results for the model shown here as the DDST3, or Dam Decision Support Tool, for Study 3, the results presentation, and dam data tables. So clearly, from the participants' perspective, the process went well, but the model still needed some work. We also asked how much the participants learned from the workshop materials and activities, and found overall lower mean scores for learning than liking, but still a lot of learning happening, especially from the posters, results, and overall experience. In our expanded literature review, we actually apply the literature review rubric to the 24 studies reviewed in the paper, but we cluster the studies by approach, as seen here on the left. I am not going to go into what each of these acronyms is for. That would take a while, but you can see the model process called Promethi gets the higher score when the rubric is applied in a way that each subcriterion has equal importance or equal weight. We had planned to take all of the evidence we collected in our observer worksheets, surveys, and our own researcher observations to fill out the stakeholder-based evaluation rubric completely, as we did for the literature review rubric here as applied to these studies. However, we have not yet completed that process. When we do, we will also be able to see how each subcriterion affects the total score for our process compared to the ones we have evaluated in the literature, much like we did with the 2-dimensional process I showed earlier. In conclusion, we conducted a literature review of how group participatory MCDA workshops have been evaluated in academic studies. We co-developed an evaluation rubric and set of methods with stakeholders to assess the success of a participatory group workshop geared toward dam, watershed, or energy decision support. We developed a set of tools to support these evaluation methods, including a sortable and editable rubric spreadsheet, a workshop observation sheet, pre- and post-survey questions. We piloted the tools to partially evaluate our own workshop. That work is still in progress. All materials are freely available for people to download and edit to suit their own purposes, and you can go here to do so. The idea behind this was not only to create something that we could use to evaluate our own workshop and compare to the workshop scores that we were able to identify from the literature, but also to develop a set of tools that people could download freely and use and change to suit their own purposes. So we hope if this seems interesting to you that you will go there and do that. I would especially like to thank our funding sources for this work, especially the USGS Water Resources Research Institute grant that we got through the Mitchell Center. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions about this presentation.